The crisp autumn air bit at Ethan Carter's face as he moved through the dense forest, his boots pressing softly into the damp earth. The towering spruce trees stood tall around him, their branches swaying gently in the morning breeze. The scent of pine and cold, fresh air filled his lungs. Alaska had a way of making a man feel small, even one who had seen war. But Ethan had long learned to appreciate its quiet majesty. After years in the army, patrolling the rugged wilderness as a park ranger gave him the peace he had been searching for. His morning patrol had been routine, checking trails, noting recent animal activity, and ensuring that no illegal poachers had disturbed the fragile ecosystem. But then he heard it. A deep, guttural roar. Not just any roar, a sound of agony, desperation, a creature in distress. Ethan stopped mid-stride, every muscle tensing. He had spent enough time in these woods to know the calls of its inhabitants. And this was not normal. His hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over his back. He didn't like using it. But out here, alone in the vast wilderness, it was sometimes necessary. The sound came again, echoing through the valley below. A bear. A big one. Ethan adjusted his pack and started moving quickly but cautiously. The terrain grew steeper as he descended toward the old quarry, a place where miners had once stripped the land of its riches before abandoning it to nature. The jagged rocks and deep pits made it a treacherous place, especially for unsuspecting animals. If a bear had fallen into one of those pits, it wouldn't be getting out on its own. The closer he got, the more distinct the sounds became. Labored breathing, pained grunts, the occasional, frustrated scrape of claws against stone. Ethan's pulse quickened. He didn't fear bears. Respect. Yes, but not fear. Out here, they were kings of the land. But even kings could find themselves in trouble. As he broke through the last of the thick brush, the scene before him stopped him cold. A massive grizzly lay at the bottom of a deep pit, its massive frame pressed against the rocky earth. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, deep gashes running along its flank. Its powerful limbs trembled with exertion, muscles taut from repeated but fruitless attempts to climb the sheer walls. Its breathing was labored, nostrils flaring as it tried to scent him. And then Ethan saw it. The bear wasn't just injured. It was pregnant. A chill ran through him, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was seeing. A mother bear in distress was already dangerous. A mother bear close to giving birth. Unable to move. In pain. That was a death sentence, for her and for the cubs she carried. Ethan moved slowly, careful not to startle her. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice low and calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." The bear's dark eyes locked onto his, her great chest rising and falling in heavy, strained breaths. There was no aggression, only exhaustion. She had been fighting for her life, and she was losing. Ethan scanned the pit. The walls were steep, almost sheer in places, at least 12 feet deep. Claw marks scored the rock where she had tried, again and again, to pull herself out. But the injury to her flank had sapped her strength. She wasn't going anywhere. His mind worked fast. He couldn't leave her here. Not like this. He reached for his radio, clicking it on. Static. No signal. He cursed under his breath. This far out, reception was spotty at best. If he was going to get her out, he would have to do it himself. Ethan's eyes flicked to the trees. He had rope in his pack, along with some climbing gear he always carried in case of emergencies. But he would need more than that. A pulley system, something to create leverage. His truck was a good 2 miles away, too far to fetch help before nightfall. And leaving her here overnight? That wasn't an option. Predators would come. Even a wounded bear could attract wolves, scavengers, or worse, humans looking for an easy kill. He set his pack down, moving quickly to gather supplies. The bear watched him, her head barely lifting. She was beyond fighting now. Ethan could see it in the way her limbs sagged, in the heavy rise and fall of her breaths. If he didn't act soon, it would be too late. With practiced efficiency, he anchored a rope to a sturdy pine and knotted the other end into a makeshift harness. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about this situation was, but it would have to do. He descended carefully, boots crunching against loose gravel as he reached the pit floor. Up close, she was even larger than he'd thought. Nearly 800 pounds of raw muscle. But in this moment, utterly helpless. The scent of blood was strong now, mixing with the damp earth. Ethan crouched just a few feet away. "I know you don't trust me," he murmured, "but I'm your best shot." The bear let out a slow, wheezing breath. Her body shuddered, gritting his teeth. He worked fast. Looping the rope under her massive torso was no easy feat, especially with her injuries. Every time she shifted, pain made her flinch, her claws scraping the rock. But she didn't lash out. Whether it was exhaustion or some unspoken understanding, she let him work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he had the rigging set. Ethan climbed out, bracing himself. He had to get this right. There were no second chances. He tied the rope to a thick branch, looping it over his truck's winch. With a deep breath, he started the slow, painstaking process of pulling her up. The bear grunted as she felt herself lifted, her massive body shifting against the restraints. For a moment, he feared she'd panic, thrash and break free, but she didn't. Inch by inch, she rose, her massive paws scrabbling for purchase. Then, with a final heave, she was free. Ethan cut the ropes and stepped back. For a long moment, she didn't move, her breathing ragged, her body trembling from the effort. Then, with slow, deliberate care, she pushed herself onto unsteady legs. Ethan stayed still. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. The bear turned toward him. For a split second, he wondered if he had just saved something that would now kill him. But she didn't attack. She simply stood there, those dark, intelligent eyes watching him. Something passed between them, something deep, something neither man nor beast could put into words. Then, with a slow, lumbering step, she turned and disappeared into the forest, fading into the wild as though she had never been there at all. Ethan let out a long breath, his pulse finally slowing. He had seen many things in his life. War, suffering, the cruelty of men. But here, in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, he had witnessed something else. A silent agreement, a moment of trust, and maybe, just maybe, a life saved. He picked up his pack, casting one last look toward the trees where she had vanished. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Ethan's fingers tightened around the radio as he listened to the response from the rescue team. 2 hours. That was how long it would take for them to reach his location. Too long. The bear was already weak. Her breaths labored, and he could see the way her muscles trembled from exhaustion. She wouldn't last that long. Every instinct told him she was close to the edge, too close. He exhaled sharply, his mind racing. The rules were clear. Never attempt a rescue alone. Never engage a wounded animal without backup. But rules didn't mean much when life was hanging by a thread. Ethan had spent years following orders, sticking to protocols, but he had also learned when to bend them. If he waited, the bear and her unborn cubs might not make it. Decision made, he moved quickly. His pack held most of what he needed: climbing gear, rope, carabiners, but there was one more thing he would have to use: the tranquilizer rifle. He always carried a light-dose sedative in case of emergencies. It wasn't a full knockout like the kind used for tagging animals. Just enough to calm a creature down, make them sluggish so they wouldn't lash out in fear or pain. Ethan unshouldered the rifle and checked the dosage. The bear was massive, but with her current state of exhaustion, The calculated amount should keep her docile without shutting her down completely. He took a steadying breath, then raised the weapon. The bear's dark eyes locked onto him. Even from a distance, Ethan could see the depth in him, not just the wild, untamed nature of a predator, but something else, something like recognition, understanding. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured under his breath. Then, he pulled the trigger. The dart flew straight and true, embedding in the bear's thick shoulder. She flinched but didn't roar or thrash. Her head turned slightly as if acknowledging the shot. And then she exhaled a long, heavy breath. Ethan watched as the tranquilizer took effect, her massive frame sagging slightly as the tension in her muscles softened. She was still awake. That was good. He didn't want her unconscious, just calm. Ethan wasted no time. He secured one end of the rope to a sturdy tree, checking the knots with the practiced efficiency of a soldier. He looped the harness over himself, tested the weight, and then began his descent into the pit. The moment his boots hit the ground, his pulse quickened. Being this close to a wild animal, even a sedated one, was dangerous. He moved cautiously, keeping his posture non-threatening. The bear stirred slightly, her breathing slow but steady. Her eyes, half-lidded, flicked toward him, still watching, still aware. Ethan crouched, scanning her injuries. The deep gash along her flank was the worst of it. The wound was fresh, possibly from a desperate attempt to claw her way out of the pit. And it had bled heavily. But there were no signs of infection, at least. Not yet. "You're a fighter, huh?" he muttered, reaching into his pack. He pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic powder, the only thing he had that might prevent the wound from worsening. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. As carefully as he could, he sprinkled the powder over the wound. The bear huffed, her massive body twitching slightly at the sting. But she didn't lash out. Ethan took that as a good sign. He worked quickly, checking for other injuries. Her paws were scraped, her muscles stiff from exertion. But the biggest danger was dehydration. If she had been trapped for more than a day, she would be running on fumes. He reached into his pack again, pulling out a collapsible water pouch. It wasn't much, but he poured a small stream near her muzzle, hoping she would take it. She hesitated, then, slowly, her tongue flicked out, lapping at the water. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Good girl," he murmured. Minutes passed. He could hear the rustling of the forest above, the distant calls of birds shifting through the canopy. The world was moving on, oblivious to the scene playing out at the bottom of this pit. A man and a bear. Two creatures who should have been enemies, sharing a fragile moment of trust. Ethan knew he didn't have much time before the tranquilizer wore off. He needed to get her out. He climbed back up, gripping the rope with trained ease, and rechecked the setup. He had fashioned a makeshift pulley using the strongest branch he could find, looping the rope so that it would distribute the weight more evenly. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to work. Now came the hard part. Ethan braced himself, then pulled. The bear, sluggish but aware, shifted as she felt the strain against her body. For a moment, she resisted, her instincts likely telling her to fight. But then she stilled, letting the lift take her weight. Ethan gritted his teeth as he heaved, inching her massive form upward, using every ounce of strength he had. His muscles screamed in protest, sweat beading along his brow despite the cool air. "Come on," he growled, digging his boots into the ground for leverage. The bear's paws scrabbled at the dirt wall as she was lifted higher. She wasn't completely limp. Her body still had enough strength to help. Even if only slightly, inch by inch, foot by foot, they climbed. Then, with one final pull, she reached the top. Ethan stumbled back, breathing hard, his hands raw from the rope. He half expected the bear to collapse. But instead, she slowly rolled onto her stomach, her massive sides heaving. The sedation was wearing off, her eyes regaining their sharpness. Ethan stood still, waiting. The bear didn't run. She turned her great head toward him, those dark eyes locking onto his once more. There was no rage in them, no fear, just something Ethan couldn't quite explain. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she lowered her head, a gesture, not submission, not weakness, something else. Ethan swallowed hard. He had seen men give nods like that before. Silent acknowledgments between soldiers. A recognition of shared struggle. Then, with a slow, lumbering gait, the bear turned and disappeared into the forest. Ethan watched her go, his heart still pounding. He had broken the rules. And he would do it again in a heartbeat. Because some lives were worth saving. As the sound of her movement faded, he reached for his radio. "Rescue team, this is Carter," he said, his voice steady. "Situations handled." A crackle of static, then a response. "Handled, you mean?" Ethan allowed himself a small smile. "She's free." And with that, he picked up his gear and started the long walk back. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands raw and aching as he worked quickly to secure the thick rope around the bear's massive torso. Every second mattered. He could feel it in the pit of his gut, the deep, primal understanding that the bear was running out of time. The sedative had slowed her breathing, but he could still see the rise and fall of her chest. The faint flicker of awareness in her dark eyes. She wasn't unconscious, just heavy with exhaustion and the drug's effects. If she panicked when she started to wake, this rescue could turn deadly fast. The system he had rigged was simple but effective. A heavy-duty pulley secured to the base of a sturdy pine tree, looped through a secondary anchor point on the rocky edge of the pit. The other end of the rope ran to his ATV, parked a few yards away, its engine idling in the cold morning air. The plan was to use the winch to gradually lift the bear out, preventing any sudden jerks that might worsen her injuries. It was the best shot they had. Taking a deep breath, Ethan double-checked the knots. They had to hold. This was a nearly 800-pound grizzly. Any slack, any mistake, and she could slip, dragging both of them back into the pit. His fingers moved fast, tightening the last loop around the bear's torso. "All right, girl," he muttered, glancing at her massive frame. "Let's get you out of here." With a final tug to ensure everything was set, he climbed out of the pit, muscles burning from the effort. His boots dug into the rocky soil as he pulled himself up and over the ledge. Standing at the top, he took a moment to steady his breath before moving toward the ATV. He placed one hand on the winch control, fingers hesitating over the button. He knew that once he started, there was no stopping. If anything went wrong, there was no backup. It was just him, a machine, and the will to fight against gravity. "Here goes nothing," he muttered and pressed the button. The winch groaned to life, the thick rope stretching taut as it began to bear the weight of the massive grizzly. The bear's limp form shifted, her paws twitching slightly as she was lifted inch by inch. The system held steady, the tension even, but Ethan didn't let himself relax. Not yet. Then the ground moved. A deep, grinding crack split the air as the dirt and loose rock along the pit's edge began to give way. Ethan's heart slammed into his ribs as the earth beneath his feet shifted violently. He staggered backward, his hands instinctively tightening around the rope. But it was worse than he feared. The collapse wasn't just under him. The ledge beneath the bear crumbled. For a split second, everything froze. The rope, the bear, the loose soil hanging in the air like a silent warning. Then it all came crashing down. The grizzly's massive body lurched downward as gravity took hold, the remaining dirt caving in around her. The rope snapped tight with brutal force. nearly jerking Ethan off his feet. His fingers burned as they locked around the coarse fibers, every muscle in his body screaming against the sudden weight threatening to drag him down. He gritted his teeth, planting his boots hard into the shifting ground. No, 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 he growled through clenched teeth, using every ounce of strength to fight back against the downward pull. His legs shook under the strain, the rope digging painfully into his hands. The ATV's winch strained against the added weight, its motor whining under the pressure. For a moment, Ethan feared it wouldn't hold, that the entire system would fail, sending them both crashing back into the pit. He pushed harder, leaning his full weight back, counterbalancing the force. His vision blurred with the effort. The rope dug deeper, cutting into his gloves, the friction burning his skin. The bear, still partially sedated, let out a low, wheezing grunt, her body dangling precariously as she struggled against the pull of gravity. Ethan sucked in a breath, drawing from every bit of strength left in him. He planted his boots firmly, adjusted his stance, and gave one final, desperate pull. The winch motor groaned louder, but the rope held. The grizzly's body began to rise again, inch by painstaking inch. Ethan didn't let up. He couldn't. He kept his grip locked, his muscles screaming in protest, his entire world narrowing to this one battle against physics. Every second felt like an eternity. The weight of the bear pressing against him, the fear that one slip, one mistake, would undo everything. Then, at last, the moment broke. With a final surge of effort, the bear's massive body cleared the pit's edge, rolling onto solid ground with a heavy thud. Ethan collapsed onto his knees, his arms trembling, breath coming in ragged gasps. His entire body was soaked in sweat despite the crisp autumn air. For several long moments, neither of them moved. The bear lay still, her chest rising and falling with slow, even breaths. The drug was wearing off, but she wasn't fully awake yet. That gave Ethan just enough time to get the hell out of her immediate vicinity. Shakily, he pushed himself to his feet, stumbling back a few steps. His hands throbbed, raw and aching from holding the rope. His lungs burned, his legs felt like lead. But none of that mattered. The bear was safe. He watched her carefully, keeping his distance. As the tranquilizer continued to fade, her massive frame shifted slightly, her limbs twitching. Ethan knew better than to stick around. A groggy, confused grizzly was still a dangerous one. Step by step, he backed away, his body screaming for rest but his instincts telling him to stay alert. Then, just as he reached the tree line, she moved. The bear let out a low, rumbling breath and slowly lifted her head. Her dark eyes, still hazy from sedation, flicked toward him. Ethan froze. There was no panic in her gaze, no immediate aggression, just recognition. For several long seconds, the two locked eyes. Ethan could feel it, that same unspoken understanding from before. He had risked everything to save her. And somehow, in whatever way a creature like her could comprehend, she knew. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate movement, the grizzly shifted her massive body and, with a great heaving effort, pulled herself upright. Her muscles trembled, but she stood. Ethan exhaled, taking one more step back. The bear gave him one last lingering glance. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she turned and lumbered toward the deep forest, her massive form disappearing into the trees. Ethan stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of her fading steps, feeling the weight of everything that had just happened. His body was wrecked, his hands bleeding, his muscles screaming for relief. But he had done it. She was alive, and somehow, that made every moment of agony, every second of fear, worth it. Finally, with a deep breath, Ethan turned toward his ATV, wiping the sweat from his brow as he muttered under his breath. "Damn bear almost killed me." Then, With one last glance toward the forest where she had vanished, he climbed onto his vehicle and rode away. Ethan stood frozen, his breath still coming in heavy, uneven gasps as the massive grizzly slowly rose to her feet. His muscles ached from the effort of hauling her out of the pit. His hands raw and blistered from gripping the rope. The morning air was crisp, but he was drenched in sweat, his body trembling from the sheer exertion. Yet none of that mattered now. The bear was standing, even with the lingering effects of the tranquilizer. She managed to steady herself, her enormous frame swaying slightly before finding balance. Her deep, dark eyes flicked toward him, locking onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine, not from fear, but from something else, something he couldn't quite explain. Ethan knew that this was the moment where things could go very wrong. A wounded, confused bear was still a dangerous one. He had seen what these creatures were capable of: raw, unstoppable power that could tear a man apart in seconds. He didn't move. His fingers twitched toward the rifle slung over his back. Not in aggression, but in instinct. But the bear didn't charge. She didn't growl, didn't bare her teeth. She just stood there, watching him. The forest around them seemed to fall silent. No birds chirping, no wind rustling through the trees. Just the quiet breathing of two beings who, by all accounts, should have been enemies. But something passed between them in that moment. Something primal and wordless. Ethan had spent years in the army, had stared into the eyes of men on the battlefield, had seen fear, rage, and desperation reflected back at him. But this was different. This wasn't fear. This wasn't a mindless, wild beast staring him down. This was understanding. He saw it in the way the bear's gaze lingered, in the way her muscles, though still weak, remained relaxed rather than tense with aggression. She had every reason to attack, every reason to lash out at the human who had dared to come so close. But she didn't, because she knew, somehow, in whatever way an animal could comprehend, she knew he had saved her. Ethan exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. He gave her a slow nod, as if acknowledging something neither of them could truly put into words. For a long moment, the two remained locked in that silent exchange. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, the bear turned. She took one step, then another, her massive paws pressing into the earth with surprising grace. There was no rush, no panic, just a steady, purposeful gait as she moved toward the tree line. The morning sun cast long shadows as she disappeared into the dense woods, her fur blending into the golden light filtering through the evergreens. And then, just like that, she was gone. Ethan let out a long, slow breath. He didn't move, didn't speak. The only sign of life around him now was the distant hum of his ATV's engine and the faint crackle of static from his radio. The rescue team. He had almost forgotten about them in the chaos. With a weary hand, he lifted the radio to his lips. "This is Carter," he said, his voice hoarse. "Bear's free. She's headed back into the woods." There was a pause, then a burst of static before a voice crackled through. "Repeat that. The bear's gone. You got her out?" Ethan let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, she's gone." A mixture of disbelief and frustration filled the next few seconds of silence before another voice responded. "We're almost to your location. Sit tight." Ethan sighed, dropping the radio back onto his belt. He could already hear the distant rumble of approaching vehicles. He knew what was coming. There would be questions, reprimands, lectures about protocol and safety. They would tell him he should have waited, that he had risked his own life needlessly, that there were procedures for situations like this. And they would be right. But none of that changed the fact that if he had waited, if he had followed the rules to the letter, that bear would have died in that pit. And she wasn't just any bear. She was a mother. Ethan glanced back toward the trees where she had vanished. He didn't know if she would make it through the winter. He didn't know if she would find enough food. If the wound on her side would heal properly. If her cubs, when they finally arrived, would have the strength to survive in the brutal Alaskan cold. But what he did know was that she had a chance. A chance she wouldn't have had if he had done nothing. And sometimes, that was enough. The sound of tires crunching against gravel snapped him from his thoughts. He turned to see 2 park ranger trucks pulling up, their flashing lights cutting through the early morning mist. A few men stepped out, their expressions ranging from concern to confusion. Ethan just smiled, shaking his head as he picked up his pack. He had no regrets. He had done what was right. And somewhere, deep in the wild heart of Alaska, a mother bear was walking free. Because of him. The cold Alaskan wind bit at Ethan Carter's face as he walked through the snow-covered forest. His boots crunching softly against the frozen ground. Winter had settled in, wrapping the land in a thick white blanket, muting the usual sounds of the wilderness. It had been nearly a year since that day, the day he had risked everything to save a mother bear and the unborn cubs she carried. And he had never stopped wondering. All through the changing seasons. As he patrolled the vast expanse of protected land, Ethan had searched for signs. Tracks in the mud, scratches on the trees, captured footage from the motion-activated cameras he had placed throughout the forest. Anything to tell him that she had survived. But the woods were vast, and nature did not leave easy answers. More than once, he had questioned if she had made it. The winter following her rescue had been brutal. The deep snows relentless. A wounded bear, forced to hunt and protect her cubs while healing, faced incredible odds. And while he had no regrets about breaking protocol to save her, the nagging uncertainty always remained in the back of his mind. Then, one morning, a report came in. A mother bear and 2 cubs had been spotted near the edge of the park's northern range. The call had come from a local tracker, an old-timer who had spent his entire life reading the signs of the land. His voice had been steady but laced with something almost like awe. "She's big, Carter, bigger than most, and she ain't afraid, not reckless, just sure of herself." Ethan's pulse had quickened at those words. Without hesitation, he'd grabbed his gear and set out. Now, as he moved carefully through the trees, he scanned the snow for any sign of them. The fresh tracks were there. Unmistakable, deep, wide prints of a fully grown grizzly, alongside the tiny, erratic steps of 2 smaller cubs. His breath misted in the air as he crouched down, running his fingers lightly over the indentations in the snow. They were close. He straightened, scanning the tree line. The early morning light filtered through the branches, casting long shadows. The air was thick with silence, the kind that only came when something big was near. Then, a flicker of movement. Ethan froze, heart hammering. She stepped into view like a ghost emerging from the past, huge, powerful, her fur thick and dusted with snow. There was no hesitation in her step. No sign of the weakness that had nearly claimed her life a year ago. She was strong. She had survived. And beside her, 2 tiny cubs trotted through the snow, their round bodies stumbling playfully as they followed their mother's lead. Ethan's breath caught. It was her. It had to be. The mother bear stopped, her dark eyes locking onto his. The cubs, unaware of the weight of the moment, busied themselves by swiping at each other with clumsy paws. But she remained still, watching him. Ethan swallowed hard. He knew bears didn't think like humans. Didn't remember in the way people did. But there was something in her gaze. Something familiar. She wasn't afraid. Wasn't defensive. She was acknowledging him. A silent recognition. They stood there like that for what felt like an eternity, man and beast. Once again in the presence of the other. And in that quiet space between them, Ethan knew the truth. She remembered. Maybe not in the way a human would. Not in words or emotions she could name. But in something deeper, a sense of trust, a knowledge that once, long ago, he had pulled her from the brink of death. One of the cubs let out a small huff. Tumbling into the snow, the mother bear turned slightly, as if making sure the little one was all right. Then looked back at Ethan. For a brief second, he thought about reaching for his camera. But he didn't. Some moments weren't meant to be captured, only lived. Then, slowly, she shifted her weight. The moment was passing. Ethan knew this was it. He gave her a slow nod. The same way he had a year ago. A silent goodbye, a thank you of his own. And then, with one last lingering glance, the great bear turned, her powerful body moving effortlessly through the snow. The cubs, still playful and oblivious, scrambled after her, leaving a trail of tiny footprints in their wake. Ethan watched until they disappeared into the trees. Only then did he exhale. A slow, steady breath filled with something he couldn't quite name. Peace, gratitude, maybe even something bordering on reverence. He had spent his life serving, fighting battles overseas, and later, protecting the land he loved. But never had he felt more connected to something greater than himself than in this moment. Somewhere out there, she would live on. Her cubs would grow, and maybe, one day, their cubs after them. And all because, 1 year ago, in the cold and the dirt, he had chosen to act. Ethan adjusted his pack and turned back toward the trail, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. Some people would never believe what had just happened. But he didn't need him to. He had seen it with his own eyes. And that was enough.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.